So step 2 is writing essential questions, and we're just going to kind of go through what essential questions are and why they're important first, and then we're going to talk about what they look like and what they are and what they aren't as well. One of the things I think that's really important about essential questions is setting purpose for kids and giving them a purpose to work with as we go through the standards. And these are from Smith and Wilhelm, but without purpose, significant learning is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. So I think in composing to transfer, kids need that purpose behind what they're doing in order to be able to make those shifts. And I think essential questions are one way at getting to that for those kids and motivating them to look at lots of different things and be critical and can create arguments out of that. So characteristics of essential questions. They're engaging. They offer potential for intriguing students and motivating their learning. They're enduring, leads to learning big ideas that have value beyond the classroom, relevant to their own lives in a lot of ways. At the heart of a discipline, one of the things, and it's kind of a writing project bias, but we really think that inquiry is the best way to get at the Common Core. And one of the things about inquiry that's really important is that we are apprenticing students into the practice of our discipline. So if we did that in all areas, they may, I think, have a daughter entering college next year. I think they would make better choices about careers because they would learn what do these people do if they're going to be scientists or if they're going to study literature. And my kids in AP Lit sometimes are like doing this all the time. I said, this is what people who study literature do. If you don't like this, don't take any more English classes when you go to college, because this is what we do. We read criticism, we critique what we read, we talk about what we read, we identify the devices that they're using and think about why they might have done it. That's what they do. So if we spend more time apprenticing kids into the practice of the discipline so they see what a scientist does in real life, then I think they would have a lot easier time in making those decisions. Essential questions are also in need of uncoverage. It involves a background of foundational principles, rich concepts, theories, and procedures that require unpacking. They're big ideas. They're not answerable through information retrieval. They're not yes/no questions. They're not understood in one day or even in a week in a lot of cases. They're not easily agreed upon, and back to what we were talking about yesterday, there isn't a right answer. Some samples. What makes a good home? For us, for bears, for lobsters, for working with habitats. What's a responsible community? If you're working on communities. What makes a great leader? Presidents, Civil War, lots of different topics you can deal with that. How has our climate shaped how we live and work? Weather unit, for example. What harms relationships? That could be in a lot of different topics, including literature. What geometry concepts would be essential to build a new gymnasium, including the ordering of materials? So math question. My husband's a math teacher, and it seems to be a game at our house to come up with the best essential questions. And I know we're as nerdy as Rachel is, but that's okay. And he was doing one, he had to do sales tax and percentages and all that kind of stuff. And we talked through a lot of them, but he came up with what's the best deal, what are the hidden costs, and he had a lot of different things. And he's doing all inquiry in math at 7th grade, so it's kind of been fun to have that. What's really important about these, I think, is collaborating and talking through them, because I'll show you an example later where I thought I had the best question ever, and he was like, that's a yes/no question, Paula. How does rap music and its counterpart, oratorical poetry, work for or against social change? That's a big one. So some ways to generate questions. You can reframe a required text or topic. We're going to work with reframing a standard because that's what we started with today. I heard some of the conversations, some of us are still so influenced by the texts or the concepts that we teach, but try to just look at the standards, and it's not easy at all. But it's, I think, really valuable, and I think that the units that I've created, starting with the standards, have focused me more in my instruction in getting kids to those skills instead of having them like the book or understand the novel or those kinds of things. Identify the problem or question from the discipline that the data addresses. So again, trying to apprentice kids into the practice of the discipline. So my central standard, and Rachel was nicer to you than she was to me because my assignment was to create a standards grouping, but I couldn't start with the argument standard. I had to start with a different one. So I started with, and you have a sheet at your tables. You have two. One's a packet on creating essential questions. They probably just plopped them down. So those give you a bunch of ideas for essential questions in multidisciplinary levels. And then there's a sheet that's a standards grouping that I created for my unit that I'm going to just talk about some stuff. So my central standard was to determine an author's point of view or purpose in a text in which the rhetoric is particularly effective, analyzing how style and content contribute to the power, persuasiveness, or beauty of the text. So what I was really interested in doing with kids is looking at texts and their arguments and stylistically how the author is able to do that. And I'll model for you after lunch today a lesson that I take my kids through that would tie back to this particular unit. Okay? So that's my central standard. So in thinking about that, then when I pulled other standards, one of the other ones I pulled was determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in a text, including figurative, connotative, and technical meanings. So we're really going to be looking at the words authors choose to use, and we'll see that again in the example lesson that I'm going to show you later this afternoon. Analyze and evaluate the effectiveness of the structure an author uses in his or her exposition or argument, including whether the structure makes points clear, convincing, and engaging. So these are all reading informational text standards that I'm focusing on, and then I'm pulling in those writing, both the argument and produce clear and coherent writing. And then you'll notice I tied back the language standard that talks about understanding what words mean and how they're applied in the different contexts. So that ties back to the reading informational text. And then speaking and listening, the kinds of activities I'm going to have my students do, which we'll do together this afternoon. So that's my standards grouping. So the next step in the process for me is, what's a good essential question that works with those particular standards? So if you look at the bottom of that standards grouping page, I started with what's the connection between style and substance? How do you know beauty when you see it? What moves us? What makes something meaningful? How can changing structure change meaning? So I'm still pulling in all these ideas about words and word choice and the way the author constructs the argument. When does an opinion become a belief? Why do we believe what we do? And then the one I liked the most, but Ramey was like, that's a yes, no question. Can values be changed without changing behaviors? So I changed that. It's always a process, and it's a process you should talk through with other people. It became, what is the relationship between values and behaviors? And that's the question that I'm going to focus on this afternoon. So then, I don't know if we're going to go to do this part right now. Rachel, you want to talk through yours? Yep. And then we'll go to the texts.
Okay, so yeah. I was just going to toss out when I was in a class last week, we were talking a lot about framing questions, and a big starting phrase was to what extent, and I know you guys know that, but just tossing it out. I was even thinking of yours right now. To what extent do values change in relationship to behaviors or learning?
Yeah, which is a great phrase when you end up with a yes or no question. So one of the things I say is try not to write a yes or no question, because then kids just go yes or no, and that's it. So it should be a process of exploring that question and the complexities. So this is my example, and I wrote these yesterday, and I just finished the last few ideas this morning, because like I said, this is a new group of standards for me. I've never planned around them before. I don't teach 7th grade, so this process is, it's very real in my mind right now of what I went through to do this. So what I did was, I looked at my central standard, and I think that's a great place to start, because that is rich and complex and something you want to focus on. So, and it had to do with argument, specific claims in the text, reasoning, and then evidence. And so this helps me to kind of make that jump from standards to writing questions. I like to jot down some of the big ideas in my central standard. So what are some of these kind of big concepts that are dealt with? And then I try to turn those into questions. So some of the big ideas here I see relate to truth, even though it doesn't use the word truth when I'm thinking about evidence. I think that that's closely related. And then, of course, evidence is a big idea here, argument, claims, and reasoning. So those are some of the most important things that I see popping up in that standard. And so here are my central questions that actually Rhonda and Jackie just helped me write a couple more. So I had just a couple this morning. I said, hey, you guys, I have these big ideas. What are some other questions that might relate to that? And they're not perfect. You know, I just finished some of them during the break. So these are the ones I was thinking about. So this idea of truth, the question, what is the truth and how important is knowing the truth story? So if we're evaluating evidence from different sources, it'd be interesting for kids to talk about that. How do people make decisions, and you know, getting at the evidence and how it fits into things. What is valid evidence? What makes a good argument? You know, and then you would get to the evidence as part of that. How do we know something is true, or why is it important to find truth? So when I'm thinking about these standards, gravitating towards this idea of truth. So I think kids could really dig into that and talk about it, and then we'd be exploring the standards in service of that. So what I want to do, what we're going to do now is take some time to brainstorm some essential questions that you could use for one group of standards. So decide now, and at this point you could decide if you want to develop a unit together with the people you were grouping with, or if you'd rather go your own direction. So it's up to you now that you kind of have that grouping to work with. And see if you can come up with some essential questions, and those would go above. There's a blank space above your grouping standards, so some ideas. And just, they don't have to be perfect, but some things that related to your central standards, some of those big ideas that you could turn into questions. Use that handout, that tips for writing and revising essential questions. There are some ideas of how you might set things up. Some of you have already started thinking about texts, because that's just, sometimes we can't stop our brains from doing that. So if that's the case, you could use those as kind of a starting point for essential questions too. So we are going to take probably about 10 minutes, which I know isn't a ton of time, and see for one group of standards if you can get some ideas down for possible essential questions.
Question they want to share? I can.
Do I need to like context what I'm doing, or?
You can if you want to.
Okay. So this is about narratives, and I have an activity where kids write colonial journals after we've done our colonial America, and so it's just like, how does one's family dynamic impact future decisions? So obviously, contextualizing colonial America, large families, and we get into the content and all that. So.
Cool. Good. Anybody else?
Yes.
Our essential question is, why does truth matter? And my thought at first was doing a compare contrast between a scene in the movie and a chapter in a book, and I just thought of To Kill a Mockingbird. But as Juanita is a special ed teacher, she could do a lot of different